We're going to start with Gar Alperovitz. And right here, Gar is the co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative, where he serves as the co-chair of the Next System Project. He's a distinguished career as a historian, political economist, activist, writer, and a government official. For 15 years, he was the Lionel R. Bowman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland and is a former fellow of King's College at Cambridge University. He is at Harvard's Institute of Politics, the Institute for Policy Studies, and a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution. He's also author of critically acclaimed books on the atomic bomb and atomic diplomacy. He's a well-known policy expert. He's testified on numerous congressional committees, lectures around the country. Among his many achievements is having been the architect of the first modern steel industry attempt of worker ownership in Youngstown, Ohio. I think that's so cool. In addition, he was nominated to be a member of the Council of Economic Advisors by leading national consumer, labor, and environmental organizations. And as a founding principal of the Democracy Collaborative, he works to develop systemic paths toward ecologically sustainable, community-oriented change and the democratization of wealth. His most recent book, What Then Must We Do, is wonderful, and it's outside to be signed by Gar afterwards. If you want to buy it out there, I recommend it to you. So we're very fortunate to have Gar here as a neighbor from Washington, D.C., and we're very eager, Gar, to hear how public banking fits into the next American revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this microphone picking things up? Yes, okay. It's the first time. Embarrassed. You shouldn't do that again. This is the woman who really deserves a hand. She's been fighting for banking all the time. What Ruth asked me to do was to try to give a little bit of perspective on where we might go in terms of the next system and how we actually change the system and produce the next system. Now, let that sit there, because most people don't actually believe that we can change the whole system. So the confrontation with that idea is the critical aspect of it, and public banking is a key element in that. So what I'd like to suggest is, as we go through the panel tonight and through the whole evening, is to keep asking the question, how do we do this step, and how does that lead to the next step, and why can we actually build a transformative politics to change something, to move it beyond corporate capitalism, beyond state socialism, and actually build the next system? We don't always ask ourselves that. We kind of waffle around it. We're trying to do good projects, we're doing good politics, we're doing good initiatives. All very important. But the framing, I think, becomes very important, and also an understanding of why possibly, and I kind of put on my historian's hat, why possibly the period that we are now in is a period of potentially transformation of the entire system. I actually think it's perhaps the most important period of American history, potentially, bar none, and I would include the American Revolution in that. So that's a heavy statement. So that's a starting point. The other starting point is that I opened my computer tonight, kind of looking at notes I was going to have for this, and there's a quote from Goethe. And the quote, which I had forgotten, was in there. It was from I don't know how it got in there, when I put it in. And it goes like this. It's a very simple quote. You commit yourself, and then the universe rearranges itself to fit. In other words, the issue of transformation and historical change is also very existential, personal. What are you going to do about that? So let me suggest, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've begun to see something rumbling up in different parts of the country that has been there slowly building, and many parts of it are beginning to take on new forms. Public banking is one part of this. There are many cities now beginning to get serious about public banking. Santa Fe and Philadelphia are probably the most advanced, but there may be others that I'm not aware of, and you guys are way ahead on it. Of course, D.C., that are beginning to pose very tough questions. Worker-owned co-ops, which for a while were kind of marginal, are now on everybody's agenda, and mayors are beginning to invest in them around the country. There are also some very expansive, some of you know about the big effort we've been involved with in Cleveland, which is a series of worker-owned co-ops linked together. and then the purchasing power of quasi-public institutions, hospitals and universities with a lot of public money, can be used to support worker-owned co-ops and complexes of them. So that's another development that's underway, the so-called evergreen development. In many, many cities, we're socializing land. We call it a land trust. That's popular. That's beginning to pop in many parts of the country. The most advanced one, of course, is in Boston. For many, many years, they had eminent domain. Eminent domain, which is city nationalization, is also on the agenda, particularly in Richmond, California. And in Boulder, Colorado, they are coming close to taking over a private utility. Now, I could go on with this kind of discussion, but if you actually look, the press does not cover this at all, the national press. So you don't find it growing, you don't find it, you don't have a sense of what's actually happening if you follow the national press. At some point, they're going to catch on that something's going on. But part of the reason is they're not interested. Secondly, the local press really is going broke, partly because of what's going on with the internet. And third, they're very conservative, so they don't invest in studying what's going on locally. But there's something exploding, and the most important characteristic, I would suggest, of these developments, all of them, is it is socialization at the scale of the city and state. That is to say, public banks, neighborhood ownership, that's another form of decentralized socialization, co-ops, public utilities, eminent domain. Taking the idea that who owns capital is critical in the power game, how institutions rearrange themselves, but rearranging that in a very, very down-home and I would say very provincially American way of starting at the bottom and building up step by step collective ownership of capital. Meanwhile, legitimating a very simple idea that who owns wealth, who owns productive wealth, is a critical issue in American culture and in transforming any system. I want to stop right there. That has not been available to most Americans for most of American modern history. That simple socialist idea, but in micro decentralized populist form, is beginning to bubble up in a very American, very pragmatic, very practical, but very important way. It opens a perspective on what might be a key feature of the next system. That is to say, transforming the ownership from the extreme concentration of wealth we now have to different forms that are highly decentralized, available to community development, available to workers, available to cities, available to states. That perspective of starting with who owns capital is a critical issue, the critical issue in the following sense. As you probably know, the top 400 people, I still can't get my head around this, so let me just lay it out. The top 400 people who you could probably squeeze into this room currently have more wealth than the bottom 186 million people taken together. So one feature of the next system and building towards it, obviously, is how we transform the ownership of wealth, and with it, the ownership of power. So that's the larger perspective from which we're coming. The Next System project, which has been developing and has got about 9,000 people have signed a statement that it's time to now talk not just about projects. Projects are critical. You get nowhere without them. But how do we build the next system begins with that premise that this can be made a real idea if you begin locally building up not only projects, sophistication, knowledge, but also different thematics, different ideas and principles that begin to take seriously that the ownership of wealth and the concentrated ownership of wealth has to change, and with it, we must find democratizing wealth itself. Now, there's another way to think about this in a very large system like the United States. Most people don't quite get how big we are. Physically, geographically, we are a continent, roughly 3,000 miles diagonal from corner to corner, now over 320 million people. Now, if there's anybody in the room who can tell me how we do participatory democracy in 3,000 miles and 320 million people, that's a real challenge. So the question of decentralization to communities, to states, to regions is also clearly on the pattern and beginning to develop as well. Regional organizations in New England and the upper Northwest. Just to give you a bit of perspective on that, you can take Germany physically, this will tell you the scale we're at, and drop it into Montana. We are a gigantic system, and the notion of regional decentralization to cities, to states, to neighborhoods, but also to regions is part and parcel of this developmental path. So as we go through some of the details tonight, and as we get deeper into some of the details, my suggestion is really twofold. To begin seeing this evolutionary development as in fact the beginning of laying groundwork, both in practical things, in practice, in structural design, in visions, in ideas and principles, democratizing ownership of capital, but also, and it really is, in my experience, a very hard place, also that this is about, actually, not about projects. It is about changing the system entirely and laying groundwork step by step, project by project, thematic, ideas by ideas, and beginning to build in that direction. One broader perspective on this as a historian, and my time I think is running down. We do it? Okay. Well, let's go. We can start. There's a way that if you think about this in a different perspective, one of the things I used to work in the government, which means I worked for a very left-wing senator, Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day. And in those days, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the liberal coalition, the progressive coalition, historically was put together with the labor movement, which was at 33.5% of the labor force organized, and the environmental movement. And you could put together, and many other people, but you could put together those particular groupings and you could get very interesting things. You got the environmental laws, you got Medicare, Medicaid, you got all the developments of the 60s. One of the changes, which is a very, very nasty change, but has some interesting dynamics on the upside, labor has gone from 35%, roughly 34.3%, of the labor force now down to 11%, roughly, and about 6 to 7% in the private sector. The traditional liberal model is fading in its capacity to hold the line, and the trends of income, wealth, and environment are beginning to show that. On the other hand, the system is not in a collapse modality. During the 1920s, government was 20%, roughly speaking, of the economy. Now it's 33%. We may or may not see a gradual destruction and decay, a stagnation of difficulty, but probably not that classic Marxist collapse, which probably would have left to the right rather than the left taking over. But a period in which more and more people are slowly, out of great pain, out of agony, beginning to sense that something really is wrong, and maybe we've got time to build from the bottom up. In a collapse, it would go to the right, I think, not the left, but building up a model that actually reflects the kind of things you see in public banking, you see in the co-op movement, you see in the land trust, you see in the public utility takeovers. Learning how to go as we build takes time. And there are a lot of unanswered questions. Nobody knows how to do really participatory planning. There's a lot of discussion about it, and it's great because people are beginning to experiment with participatory budgeting and then maybe participatory planning. The elements of design, this is really critical historically, the elements of design that you would need to redesign the entire system are being experimented with, tested, and explored even now around the country in different ways. That's a big deal. When people actually are beginning to think this stuff we're doing is developing principles, and it's also developing people. We mentioned the Youngstown fight. This was in 1977. It was the first time a big steel mill went down in the United States, and huge loss. 5,000 people lost their jobs in one day. Black September, they called it. Black September, they called it. And it was front page news in every major newspaper, and front page number led to all the television shows. Now it happens all the time, so you don't even hear about it. But in those days, that was a big deal, and the workers, and in that case, the local churches, got together to try to take over the mill. It's a gigantic steel mill. You couldn't find anybody then, and now think about this as a historical development, who knew how to do it. Now there are people, and this is part of the historical development process, you want to set up a worker-owned company, there are people all over the country who know how to do it. That's an extraordinary change in the development of people and knowledge and part of the historical base that is building up. So I want to suggest to you in my one and a half minutes left is that if we look at what the rest of the panel is going to be talking about, I think in more detail, not as just what's happening here, which is very important what's happening here, but as part of a larger process that's laying down knowledge and ideas and experience and building people who actually know how to do things that they didn't know how to do before. This era, potentially, and I am speaking to the person in your chair, this era potentially is a period of establishing the preconditions of a great transformation. One never knows whether it's possible actually to achieve that. But what is happening is laying down the kinds of preconditions in experience and knowledge, not only for possible transformation as time goes on, building forward. Think of the 3 decades before the New Deal, establishing the basis of Social Security, of labor law that later became national. Not only in people and ideas, but also in the know-how and collective wisdom and the sense of building a movement. It is a time potentially of really transformative possibility. And I think what's exciting about what's happening here in DC and with the public banking is that you see it. A few years ago, starting the conversations about public banking was not easy. And now they're beginning to grow and expand and lots of activities. That's what I'm talking about. And this is happening in many parts of the country. So I want to suggest to you, in Goethe's terms, that if you commit to making the attempt at transformation, you got a shot. If you hang back and look at it, you're out of the game. And what's really interesting about the public banking movement here and around the country is that kind of commitment is really on the cards now and very, very important. Thank you very much.